We live in a country where politicians are more afraid of voters than voters are of politicians. That's how we want it. That feels filthier. That feels like a grosser part of rock and roll, but not what I think. And you know that.
Over to you, Chris.
Like, I don't know.
What if he's still around?
Cool story, comma, bro.
Wow, how do we match the energy of that whiz-bang opening that our friends here have put together, Chris? That was wild.
Smoking hot. I don't know if I can deliver. I wouldn't have worn a bow tie if I knew I had to deliver on smoking hot. That's too much.
Well, this is a big day for us, Chris, because not only did we have our first sort of, pre-produced open like that, which is pretty cool, but this is the first time we're actually going live. We're doing it live. There are people actually presumably watching us now in real time on thehill.com. It's a staggering thought. And by the way, eventually we're going to do this. This is one small step, but the giant leap, which will be in our near future, will be to do it live and take audience questions. So that's going to be fun.
Would you like to
see you,
sir? Not to importune you. But would you like to tell them what this is? Perhaps
yes.
You should say what this show is.
Oh, okay. Yes, you're so right. You're so right. This is Whole Hog Politics. My name is Bill Sammon. I'm joined by my old pal, Chris Stirewalt. We both work at The Hill and News Nation, but only you, Chris, are the author of Whole Hog Politics, the straight fire political newsletter that runs every week on thehill.com. And, you brought the goods again this week, leading off with the incredible story out of Minnesota. Chris, so much has happened in the last week in Minnesota. It's just amazing. If you go back, not even a week ago, the big story was this burgeoning welfare fraud scandal that was, billions of dollars wasted in Minnesota and dozens of people indicted, all under the watch of, a Democratic Governor Tim Walz, who was Kamala Harris's running mate in 2024. So Republicans were really salivating. They really had, kind of the energy on their side. This scandal had a lot to do with Somali immigrants. And so Trump sent a lot of ICE agents and federal agents into Minnesota to see if there were illegals that could be ejected from Minnesota, as he has done in a lot of other places in the country. And then a bunch of other really big things happened. One was Tim Walz, unexpectedly, I think, decided he was not going to run for re-election. I think largely because of this scandal had made his brand so toxic. But then secondly, tragically, we saw the shooting of a demonstrator by an ICE agent in Minneapolis, which really has turned this thing around. And I just want to read one line from your excellent column today that kind of sums it up. Quote, in the span of a week, what had been a boon to Republicans, a scandal involving Democrats' 2024 vice presidential nominee that reinforced effective lines of attack from the presidential campaign, has turned into a debacle for the GOP, end quote. Chris, expand on that a little bit, because I want to dig into the particulars and unpack that, if you will.
Well, look, I've been covering presidential campaigns since 2004. I was a cub reporter and wormed my way into the chance to cover the 2004 presidential election. You have been doing it longer even than me. And the pace of the way that news shapes political perception inside the relatively brief period of a presidential campaign, right? So let's say primaries are locked up by the 1st of April, election days in November. And then you spend those months back and forth and who said this and what's the scandal of the day and what's the story and what's the narrative and who's controlling the narrative and blah, 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 blah. And that sort of the tumescence of the news cycle where it just keeps happening and everything seems like it's a big deal and you don't really know what's moving voters. It's like that all the time now, right? So in the course of, and Minnesota provides a great microcosm for how it is in terms of, and leaving aside the questions of the law, leaving aside the questions of the tragedy and the heartbreak and all of those things. If you want to talk about what are the political ramifications when stuff like this happens, it's just a week, right?
Yeah.
It's just a daggone week. And you saw at the beginning, the Republicans were like, we know how to do this, right? The gross mismanagement of welfare programs in Minnesota that had obviously begun during the COVID surge had been cooking off. There had been a bunch of prosecutions. There had been a bunch of stuff. And then this YouTuber delivers these videos and MAGA's like, we know what to do with this, right? It was reminiscent to me of the consumed pets of Springfield, Ohio. We know what to do. Flood the zone, hammer it, talk about it. It's good when the targets claim racism. It's good when they squeal about how mean you're being, because that fits the narrative of like, oh yeah, these people, they don't care about you. They don't care about your tax dollars. They care about Somali immigrants who are ripping the country off for billions of dollars. J.D. Vance was asked in an interview about concerns about, I think it was about housing. It was some sort of, Tony Dockable on CBS asked him a question about, I think it was housing. I forget what it was. But his answer was, well, because Somalis are taking your money. And that's the kind of relentless message discipline and the kind of brutal sort of in-your-face politics that worked for them in the 2024 election. So you see
There's an economy of words there.
Yeah, right.
Just the distilling it down to.
And it's the answer to every question, right? So whatever Tony Dockable would have asked J.D. Vance, if he would have asked him about how come it doesn't seem like American cheese slices from the deli are as good as the ones in the plastic wrap, he would have said, well, if we're paying Somali immigrants to rip us off, then Americans will never have good American cheese. So it's the kind of brutal message discipline that works in a campaign. And so they all flood in on this story and they're going for it. And Tim Walz, the other thing that happened in addition to Tim Walz dropping out was that Amy Klobuchar,
that's right, Senator Amy Klobuchar,
who's
of
a
Minnesota,
beast of a politician in Minnesota. She had, in her fourth run, which was the worst year of her 4 cycles running in statewide in Minnesota, she still won by 16 points in a year that Kamala Harris only carried Minnesota by 4.5 points. So Amy Klobuchar says, yeah, I think I might run for governor. What? So Walz drops out.
A bombshell in and of itself.
Totally. Walz drops out. Klobuchar says, maybe I'll run for governor, which doesn't give Republicans an extra Senate seat to run for in Minnesota, because if she wins, she can appoint her own replacement that will have to run in a special election next year. And you're like, oh my gosh, everything is changing immediately about this scandal in Minnesota and its implications. And just as I would, what got me thinking about it was, if I'd written the top of this note on Tuesday, right, instead, if I were writing this for Tuesday or Wednesday, it would have been a totally different story than it was by writing it for Friday. By the time I'm writing it for Friday and the killing of this woman, you're like, well, now we've gone all the way to the other side. We went from big Republican advantage to like, oh, maybe the Democrats, through Walz's resignation and Klobuchar's interest, have neutralized some of the damage for Democrats here, to all the way to the response from the administration that results in this tragic scene, this that grips the nation's attention for however brief a time. And all of a sudden, the joke for Republicans always has been that the media says, insofar as there's still a media, says Republicans pounce, right? Oh, Republican overreach, Republican pounce, because it was mimetic, right? It was the way that the press would deal when things were bad for Democrats. Many in the mainstream press would say, oh, well, Republicans pounce. And they would try to sort of he lied.
As opposed to, and when things were bad for Republicans, the press just reported things are bad for Republicans. But when things are bad for Democrats, the press reported Republicans pounce.
So
and secondarily, they're pouncing on something that apparently is bad for Democrats.
Yes, exactly. So that idea, that trope is hardwired into the Republican brain. So I say this advisedly, but this is definitely a case where overreach and overreaction. Now, who knows what overreach and overreaction happens next? We're doing this live. There could be riots in a bunch of cities by the end of this day. I don't know.
Yeah. There's a couple more twists to the story, I'm sure.
And a week from now, we may have a totally different story and one that's very bad for Democrats. But you can see in microcosm how the decision to punch everybody in the face, flood the zone, send the troops in, get hard, be rough, turned a story around in a heartbeat.
Well, yeah, and I think Republicans would argue, there were a lot of decisions that led to this tragedy, and on the other side was the decision by demonstrators to do what they did. I'm certainly not justifying or rationalizing this absolute senseless tragedy, but a lot of people did a lot of things that resulted in this, and it was a complicated situation. Chris, I want to ask you. You talk about how the tide has shifted politically on this whole situation, but I might argue that it's less about Minnesota than the national political scene, because isn't it true, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Minnesota being a blue state, you talk about the governor's race, and Klobuchar is now thinking about getting in. We haven't mentioned there's a special Senate election this year. I believe it's this year. Yes,
I think it's just a regular. It's Tina Smith isn't seeking re-election.
Right. Yeah, it's a regular election. It's from Tina Smith, who got in a special election.
Yeah.
And then she ran another term, and now she doesn't want. She's not going to run another full term, but in that race, that's going to be an election. My point being that no matter what had happened over the past week, I might argue that Minnesota, as far as Republican expectations, was probably going to remain a blue state, both in the governor's mansion and in the Senate seats. I mean, look, the trouble that Walz was having and the scandal with the fraud thing, I maybe was a little tantalizing, and hey, maybe this thing will be a little closer. But I don't think that in the calculation that Republicans have been making about how do we hold on to the Senate in November, Minnesota loomed large in that equation.
But that's sort of my point, is that if we were having this conversation a week ago, what would I be saying? I would say, well, it's a reach for Republicans, and they got to find a way to. Donald Trump has to find a way to get the My Pillow guy, Mike Lindell, sidelined somehow in this race, right? Put him in charge of the Kennedy Center or something. Like, find a way to get
the Trump Kennedy Center.
The Trump apologies,
sir.
They would have to find some way to neutralize Mike Lindell. But if Tim Walz had stayed on the ticket and this scandal was cooking off, and the other advantage that Republicans have in Minnesota, not to remain Minnesota focused, they're going to have a rotten primary. The Democrats are going to have a rotten primary in Minnesota. They've got Angie Craig. She's a congresswoman. She's a mainstream, moderate-y kind of Democrat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then they have the lieutenant governor, who is not, right? So Minnesota Democratic politics.
Peggy Flanagan.
Yeah. Minnesota Democratic politics are deeply divided between old-fashioned, hot dish, Lutheran kind of Klobuchar voting, old-fashioned. They would call themselves progressives, but in the olden days you'd call liberals, right? Those folks, and a much harder, more radical Keith Ellison, super progressive. And the story of Tim Walz and how Tim Walz lost the thread. He was one of those old-fashioned hot dish moderates. He got elected governor and said, actually, this time is different, and we're going for it. And he gave the progressives everything that they wanted. And
sort of like Biden did.
Yes, and oversaw this astonishing session of the state legislature when he was there, where they just pushed it all through. And the conflict in Minnesota, so my point being, Minnesota if we were having this conversation a week ago, we would have said, well, look, I would have said, look, Republicans have a chance to flip a seat in Georgia. I don't know how they're going to end up. They got a potentially winner in Derek Dooley that could make that race a lot easier for them if they nominate him. But John Ossoff's in big trouble. So you take that one and you add in that the Democrats might have to defend hard in Minnesota. If Tim Walz is on the ticket, the scandal put the stink on him. He's weakened.
No, I hear you.
And so that's two. So then you go over the other side of the ledger and you say, okay, can the Democrats knock off Susan Collins? North Carolina looks real good for Democrats. That's two. So if you could do that, right, you're just even. Now, Mary Peltola is talking about really seriously running in Alaska. That puts Dan Sullivan. Yeah. If you're wondering why Dan Sullivan voted with Democrats to extend the Obamacare subsidies in Alaska, Mary Peltola gave us the answer this week when she was like, yeah, I feel like maybe a Senate run could be cool for me. So the reason Minnesota is important, yes, it has to do with the map. Yes, it has to do with that stuff. But it's also, to use a terrible term, the vibes, right? Like nationalizing a local story.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the Peggy Flanagan case, who is the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, and she's running to be senator, to be replacing Tina Smith in November. She's in the Democratic primary. As you said, she's the sort of hard left liberal. By the way, she took a ton of heat the other day for appearing in a hijab with Somali Americans in a video that was just absolutely got a lot of criticism from the right. But, you know, my point is this. You look at somebody like Peggy Flanagan, who, you know, you could make the argument that this is something that the Republicans could make some hay out of. And then you start to look at the trend across, and you mentioned Maine, okay, Susan Collins. We've talked before about Graham Plattner, who is similarly a Democrat running in the Democratic primary for a Senate seat only in Maine. He, of course, came under fire for, you know, describing himself as a communist and so on, and, you know, hating on cops and all that. You've got Jasmine Crockett down in Texas.
Well, I don't think they're going to have to worry about old Jasmine Crockett.
No, but I'm saying from a messaging standpoint, you start to see enough people like that, and if you're a Republican message meister looking for, you know, narratives for the 2026 elections, you start to weave these people together. You look at Mamdani's. By the way, Mamdani, I think we now know that he didn't decide to tack to the center once he got into office. I mean, he appoints this tenant advocate who's talking about, you know, home ownership is I guess racism and white privilege and all this crazy stuff. And instead of, you know, like being abashed by it, Mamdani's like, no, yeah, this is my tenant advocate, and, you know, too bad. So that's a data point too. Like the Democrats are, you know, like Mamdani, he's owning it. He's saying, yeah, I got elected as a socialist and I'm going to govern as a socialist. I think my point is that if you're a Republican in a tough year, we've talked a lot about how Trump's approval ratings are going to be a real anchor around Republican chances to you know, do better in the House and Senate. But there are some things that the Republicans have to work with, and I think they are these. You know, you pick the extremes, you pick the Mamdanis and the people that he's surrounding himself with. You pick the Peggy Flanagan, Graham Plattner, Jasmine Crockett, and, you know, pretty soon you've got a little narrative going.
Well, the way. So yes, Republicans are going to do that no matter what. Right. No matter what, the Republican.
Yeah, but it helps to have the material.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
It helps you got to have the raw material to work with it.
This is my point. Republicans are going to say that no matter what. The question is not whether Republicans will do that. The question is, will Democrats help them do that? How did Republicans blow it in 2022? They had a similar midterm situation as Democrats do now, and they blew it. How did they blow it? They blew it by being weirdos, and they blew it by by unsettled problems inside their party between the radical and mainstream wings. The 2022 midterm election, is a story about, hey, Republicans, can we be normal? And the Republicans were like, I don't know. I'm not feeling it. I think we need Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz. It was like, oh, really? I don't know if you guys ought to do that. You might better have some boring normal person who can just run as a credible alternative to an unpopular party in power. And they couldn't do it because they were feeling too weird. And maybe Democrats are feeling too weird this time. And if they do that, right, the gains that they experience. So there's a world in which Democrats win the Senate. It's not the likeliest scenario. They're sort of giving Texas away. Jasmine Crockett's entry into the Texas primary, which the first round takes place in March. If she wins that going away, Democrats will be lucky.
Texas.
Yeah, well, if they're lucky, what will happen if you're a Democrat is that Jasmine Crockett wins not in a runoff. She wins outright in the first round. And the first polling in the race, and John Cornyn wins in the Republican side.
Beats Paxton. Yeah,
he'll probably have to go through a runoff, but that's like May, I think. If that happens, then Democrats can say like, Jasmine, who? I don't know that lady. She's running 22 points behind John Cornyn. I don't know what you're talking about. But my point in all of that is this. We're broadcasting this at 9:21 here on the East Coast.
Live, no less.
Live. Is if the Supreme Court today says, yeah, the president doesn't have the power unilaterally to slap tariffs on the whole planet, that would be a loss for the administration, but a boon for Republicans in November, right? We're here that we got these crummy jobs numbers.
They very well could do that.
Right. And we have these crummy jobs numbers out today, 50,000 hired in December. It's blah. The blah of everything continues. If the Supreme Court were to spike those tariffs today, the amount of investment, the amount of job creation, because all of this money has been sitting on the sidelines as investors and owners of businesses and employers have said, like, I don't know what's going to happen. If they had certainty on that, that'd be great for the economy. Pointing that out to say, what is good or bad for your party's chances in November? If the goal is for Democrats to win as many seats as possible, and to win, 35 House seats, maybe more, to have a real shot at flipping the Senate or at least pushing it to a tie. If that's the Democrats' goal, this has been a good week. But if it results in riots in a bunch of places and a deepening feeling of concern and chaos, maybe it ends up being bad. Who knows? So, like, you gotta play the whole ball game.
Yeah, Chris, before we move on to a couple of other foreign policy hotspots, who knew Venezuela would be down to number 3 on the list, a weekend, or not even a weekend. I want to talk about another election or another politician that you highlighted in your column this morning. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, you can receive Chris's column for free by scanning the QR code on the screen right now. Look at that live, the QR code appeared.
Look at the size of that code.
On this program is unbelievable. You talk about Gavin Newsom. You mentioned Gavin Newsom. You quoted from a lengthy Atlantic profile on Gavin Newsom, which talked about him being the front runner and talked about how it's better to be, what was it? It's better to be strong and wrong than weak and right. But let me
he was selling you supplements. Gavin Newsom reads in that interview like he's selling you supplements. He's like a factor representative.
To that end, let me read my favorite quote from that article. Quote, as a heterosexual white man from a Catholic background, nothing about his identity is electorally risky. He is tall, 6'3", and good-looking in a faintly sinister way. The defining question, who is Gavin Newsom really, underneath the charm and the smarm? I thought that kind of summed up a lot there, the writer putting that kind of a take on it. And we've talked before about, it's easy to say, well, here we are in we're still years from the presidential election. The idea that the guy that's the front runner is still going to be the nominee, blah, blah, blah. And it feels a little different this cycle. It feels like Newsom has almost a prohibitive lead on the Democratic side. The only other two names that really, the people that I respect that talk about this kind of thing, the two names that I keep hearing are Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, and AOC from Congress. But other than that, it just feels like it's Newsom's game to lose.
Just as a proviso for all of it, who Democrats are willing to nominate in 2028 will happen in the context of how concerned they are about who the Republicans are going to nominate, right?
Yeah.
If Donald Trump has a 29% approval rating and JD Vance is sucking wind and it looks like they're a disaster, Democrats may get freaky, right?
Yeah.
They may say, like,
an AOC.
They say we can do whatever we want. We don't have to worry about it. But, when Democrats nominated, the last time Democrats nominated a moderate, and Gavin Newsom's a moderate in the sense of he wants to be popular. So he moderates in the sense of, like, what's the Groucho Marx line? These are my positions. If you don't like these, we have others. So Gavin Newsom is a politician. And the last time that Democrats did that was 1992. And they said, who is this slick, phony guy from Arkansas? We don't know him. He doesn't seem to stand for anything. He is oleaginous. He is willing to pander to the right wingers. Rudy Ray Rector's execution, always most notably to me. So
who is this? Getting a piece of pecan pie.
Yeah. So who's this guy? And they said he's a guy who might beat George H.W. Bush. That's who Democrats said he was, and he was good at it. So if for Gavin Newsom, it's like, yeah, I'm slick. Yeah, I'm a politician. Yeah. What do I believe? That quote, the reason I chose that quote from Gavin Newsom was him telling Democrats, shut up. You shut up. You quit feeling all your feelings and talking about a political party. This is a pretty cynical way to put it, but a political party could be thought of as a collection of lies and untruths that you can get enough people to agree to espouse simultaneously for their own political betterment. And this is a process that happens over time, and but basically it's a collective action phenomenon by which you say, we're all going to say this now, when we've all agreed that we're going to say this, because some of us actually believe it, but for coalitional purposes and electoral purposes, we're all just going to say this. And whether that's trans women or women, or that we will be greeted as liberators in Iraq, or whatever the thing that you're supposed to say, is that people say it. So what Gavin Newsom is saying to Democrats is, shut up, let us win. Now, juxtapose that with another guy who I think is highly unlikely to be the Democratic nominee. But Rahm Emanuel gave this really interesting interview to David Drucker at the Dispatch. And Emanuel was out doing some actual kind of real politics, meeting with trade unions in Nevada. And Drucker asked him, hey, do you think Democrats should apologize for letting Joe Biden, who was by that point a petrified redwood, should Democrats be apologizing for it? And he went on a blistering hot rip about what Democrats should be apologizing for, which is blowing COVID.
Yeah.
And I thought
that was amazing. He was talking about what we should apologize for is shutting down schools and
keeping them shut
down. Generation of students because we put these unreasonable, we were preachy about it and we were pompous about it.
Politically timid. We couldn't confront our own coalition.
I meant to bring that quote today.
He took the paint off him. So here's a thought experiment.
He said that the word that he kept coming back to the one word to describe his own party, which was weak.
Weak.
Kept coming back to the word weak.
And Gavin Newsom has one version, and Rahm Emanuel has another about what strength looks like. And here's an interesting thought experiment. If Gavin Newsom, so let's say that the front runner on the progressive side is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who said that she would beat J.D. Vance's blank. She was asked about it. She said she would beat his blank. And let's say the front runner on the mainstream side of the Democratic Party, or the traditional, whatever you want to call it, moderate, is Gavin Newsom. Then we think, okay, who are the other contenders in these spaces, and what will they cause those candidates to do over the next 2 years? What pressures will, so it's the primary within a primary within a primary. So Rahm Emanuel is a real interesting cat, because if he got some traction and posed any kind of a credible threat that he could siphon off votes from Gavin Newsom, he might cause Gavin Newsom to have to double down on some of his own moderation and some of his own tough talk for Democrats. Who would be challenging Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the left? Which way might they push her? So you got to mark these bogeys as they come on your radar screen.
Yeah.
About like, where's this going? Josh Shapiro, I think, very popular governor of Pennsylvania. I have not yet seen what makes him, I think he's not overrated in the way that Gretchen Whitmer is overrated. No one could be as overrated as Gretchen Whitmer was. Remember when she held up the binder? But I have not yet seen the story where what's the question that Josh Shapiro is answering for Democrats? If it's an electability question, why wouldn't they just take Newsom?
Yeah. Chris, we got to touch on Venezuela. Again, it's a commentary on the nature of our news cycle that we're just getting to Venezuela. By the way, J.D. Vance did a briefing in the White House press briefing room yesterday, I believe it was. And obviously it was about Minnesota, but I was so struck by the fact that no one even asked him about Venezuela until something like 20 minutes in. But my question is this, Chris, when the United States went in and took out Nicolas Maduro, brought him and extracted him and his wife back to the United States for trial, and just sort of took out the head of state of a country, there was so much wailing and gnashing of teeth here in the political world that this was the craziest thing I've ever heard. And now it's sort of like, yeah, I guess it's, and remember in those first days, there was this, are we going to run the place? Because Trump said, well, yeah, we'll run it, because he doesn't really have that nuanced diplo speak the way that Marco Rubio can kind of finesse these words. But the truth is, it seems now more likely that we're not going to really run it, and we're not probably going to have boots on the ground, or maybe a few. It feels like we're going to use Marco Rubio's favorite word, leverage, to get Venezuela to behave in the way we want. And moreover, I want to just touch on Cuba, because you talked about J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio and all this. Which is, of course, those are the two big rivals on the Republican side for the presidential nomination coming up, presumably. And I got to tell you, with still several years left in the Trump administration, I now believe that it's more likely than not that they make a move on Cuba. I just can't believe we're going to get to the end of 2028 and they haven't made a move on Cuba. It just feels like, and you have the Secretary of State who happens to be, of Cuban descent, and he's had this bugaboo, and there is a real possibility of, on the Republican side, of like ridding the Western Hemisphere of some of these old line communist regimes. And fulfilling a long-held ambition, sort of a vestige of the Cold War, to sweep away these last vestiges of the commies in the Western Hemisphere. And that, by the way, has political implications, domestic political implications in and of itself. In other words, if Venezuela and Cuba go okay for the Trump team, which is a big if, maybe that is a good thing for the Rubios of the world and for Republicans writ large. If they go south, then it's sort of like another Minneapolis, right? Only bigger.
Well, look, I think the once it became clear that it was not, in fact, regime change in Venezuela. Look, the action against Venezuela is unpopular, will be it's unpopular. People don't like it. It's not something American voters respond to. It's a no, generally speaking. Foreign adventuring is unpopular. And unless you've been attacked or whatever, it's just a no. It's just a no from voters. And Donald Trump knows that because it helped him become president. Because when he stuck his thumb in the eye of the Republican Party over the Iraq War and was like, George Bush should have been impeached. He should have been impeached, not just for going in, but after going in, not taking their oil, and was like, you dummies. And that really helped him. I remember that in New Hampshire in 2016. That was hugely helpful to Trump. He knew it, right? So that's the hard political reality. What softens the reality is once it became clear, it's not regime change. It's regime rental. That the United States says, oh, okay, so this thug is out. How about these thugs? So this is a very, to go even farther back, it's a very Ferdinand Marcos situation.
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Where it's like, okay, who do we have who can run this place with an iron fist? Who will do it? Because what we want out of Venezuela is oil and money. And we want stability. We want a friend. We don't have to worry about it. And we want them, as you say, to cut off Cuba. We want them to shut Cuba down. So, we're watching in Iran a protest. The Iranian government shut down the internet for the people of Iran yesterday. The currency is crushed. The possibility of the regime in Tehran, we've seen it many times before, and it's come to naught. But this one maybe looks a little different because it's economic and not rights-based. Right. That people are fed up over the conditions. The conditions in Cuba have been terrible for 60 years, right? Yeah. But certainly in the post-Soviet and now sort of post-Russian ability to project strength, as Russia has been bled out by its misadventures in Ukraine, it's bad for Cuba, but somehow the regime has held. If the United States, what are the practical limits? Donald Trump was asked, like, what limits you? What limits your military activity? With the let's be clear,
his own morality, wouldn't he say?
Yeah, let's be clear. Answer? 2 years ago, if in the run up to the 2024 election, somebody had said Donald Trump is going to threaten to invade Greenland, and when asked what limits his ability to use military force, the United States military would have said only my own morality. If that would have happened during the election year, we would have been like, what is it would have cost him. I don't know that it would have cost him the election because people wouldn't have taken it seriously, but it would have been an insane thing to say. So Congress this week the House failed to override a couple of Trump vetoes that were targeted at Colorado over the 2020. He's punishing Colorado for
and Florida.
Yeah, and for failing to go along with the 2020 scam and all that stuff. So the House failed to override those vetoes, but they succeeded in discharging the Obamacare subsidy extensions. The Senate voted to, and it'll fail, I assume, the War Powers resolution that will now need 60 votes, but got a handful of Republicans to go along on the War Powers Act. Yeah. What we're actively seeing now is that Republicans who were okay with the Venezuela move, because it depends on which definition you accept. If you ask Marco Rubio what happened in Venezuela, it was not regime change. It was a law enforcement action aided by the United States military. This is a Department of Justice action going in to take out a criminal, just like we did with Manuel Noriega in Panama in the 1980s. No difference. This is a law enforcement action. And now we just hope Venezuela does the right thing. We're here to work with them if they want to work with us. That's a story that plenty of Republicans can live with, right? They're like, okay, keep it there. But then, of course, they won't shut up. Then, of course, that's like we're running it and you shut up and we're going to invade Greenland. We're taking Cuba out and all this stuff, which tells normie Republicans like, if you think the only constraint on your ability to send American troops into harm's way is your own morality, then we got a real problem, brother. And I think the next chapter of 2026 is going to be a lot more centered on Congress. We saw today that they got those 3 bills through on the House side. If Congress does start acting like, okay, we have to assert ourselves out of just to save the authority of our branch, just to show that, and for a lot of Republicans, to show that we're not totally cowed by Trump, things could get spicy.
Yeah, and you're starting to see that. By the way, our founders, and we're obviously in the 250th year of this republic. The whole idea of setting up the government the way they did was because they didn't want to rely on our better angels to keep things on the straight and narrow. They, in fact, basically said, men left to their own devices are not going to listen to their better angels. So we got to put a couple systems in place here. So for Trump to say, yeah, it's my own morality is the only thing that's restraining me from doing whatever I want, whatever. That's another conversation. Chris, in addition to you writing Whole Hog Politics, you also host a television show, a wonderful television show that's aired every Sunday morning on News Nation called The Hill Sunday.
True.
The reason I mention that is because I was just curious if you had any thoughts on the upcoming show this weekend on The Hill Sunday.
You want to come on? Look, there's so much news. There's so much news swirling. Our team of expert bookers is like, every 30 minutes, you're like, okay, we could talk to this person about this. And they're like, well, what if the Supreme Court? And you're like, okay, well, we could talk to this person about that. So we don't know exactly who yet, but we do have a banger of a panel. And I know we've got Paul Kane, who actually, Paul Kane from the Washington Post, who did
congressional reporter,
did a fantastic interview with Steny Hoyer, who announced his retirement. Steny Hoyer got elected to Congress in 1980.
Wow.
1980.
And he is, I think, 86 now. Maryland, he was he served as majority leader
for 20 years. For 20 years, that dude was in leadership.
He was Nancy's Pelosi's second in command, kind of.
He was the moderate to her liberal, and he was the guy for the old line, the old guard. And Paul Kane has this great interview with him about and he's the end. Steny Hoyer is the end of. Steny Hoyer was not a blue dog per se, but he was the vanguard of a kind of moderate, reddish tinged district kind of Democrat who came in the 1970s, and now he's gone. The amount of change in Congress.
That he has witnessed.
And how different, no matter what happens in midterms, based on all these retirements, Nancy Pelosi will be gone, Steny Hoyer will be gone. The United States Congress is going to be a profoundly different institution a year from now, regardless of how the midterm elections go.
Yeah. That's all the time we have for this week. I am Bill Sammon, joined as usual by my old pal, Chris Stirewalt. We will see you next week on another edition of Whole Hog Politics.
Suey.